how Spain accidentally conquered half the world and then forgot where it put it. America, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when maps were mostly empty. Compasses were suspicious little needles pointing vaguely north, and powerful kings made decisions based on whoever shouted the most confidently at court that week. So, settle in, dim the lights. Let your brain soften a little, like a warm loaf of bread fresh from a colonial oven. Because this evening, we're exploring how Spain, yes, Spain, accidentally conquered half the world, and then, with impressive absent-mindedness, proceeded to misplace most of it. It's a story of ambition, ego, drifting ships, baffled monarchs, and enough paperwork to bury an empire. A story that begins in Europe. Duritu wanders across oceans, stumbles into America, and ends with Spain sighing as it realizes what a logistical nightmare global domination actually is. So, let's begin, very gently, with a family of royals who had no idea what they were about to unleash on the planet. In the late 1400s, Spain was not exactly the global powerhouse people later imagined. It was more like a newlywed couple trying desperately to appear stable while their relatives kept causing problems in the background. Two rulers, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, had married, joining their kingdoms into a single entity. Together, they were known as the Catholic monarchs, which sounds peaceful, but really just meant they were extremely committed to micromanaging everyone's religious choices. Their court was full of advisors, priests, noblemen, and the occasional ambitious explorer trying to get the royal couple's attention. Among them was a man who dressed like a disappointed monk and pitched ideas like a medieval startup founder. His name was Christopher Columbus, a man who, to put it softly, had an aggressive relationship with geography. Columbus and his extremely confident mistake. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west. This was technically true if you ignore the minor detail of an entire continent sitting in the way. He had spent years trying to convince European monarchs to fund his plan. Most of them said no because they had access to mathematicians. But Ferdinand and Isabella, perhaps tired, perhaps curious, or perhaps in that dangerous mood where someone thinks, well, what's the worst that could happen? They said yes, and so, in 1492, Columbus sailed off, collided with the Caribbean, declared it India, and then repeatedly insisted it was India long after it became clear he had absolutely no idea where he was. Spain was delighted anyway. They claimed everything he saw, touched, or mispronounced, because of course they did. And just like that, Spain found itself the proud, if somewhat confused, owner of lands stretching from the Caribbean to mainland America, lands that Spain absolutely did not have a plan for. When Spain accidentally became a superpower, news of Columbus's discovery spread quickly. The monarchs smiled, nodded politely in public, and then almost certainly did a small, private victory dance in the royal bedroom. This was big, and also, unfortunately for Spain, extremely complicated. Suddenly, they had ports, rivers, mountain ranges, tropical islands, unfamiliar people, unfamiliar foods, unfamiliar everything, and it all needed to be named, governed, taxed, and reported on, preferably by someone who knew what West meant. Spoiler, not Columbus. But Spain wasn't done. More explorers left its shores. Cortez, Pizarro, Balboa, De Soto, men who believed that destiny, gold, and occasionally their own haircuts justified any decision. And somehow, absurd as it seems, they did conquer half the world. They toppled enormous empires in the Americas. They claimed vast territories across South America, Central America, Mexico, and large swaths of what would later become the United States. Spain looked at this unprecedented success and responded by doing absolutely nothing to prepare for maintaining it. The royal personalities. Behind the chaos, let's drift now, gently, into the royal households of Spain. Because what's an empire without the mildly dysfunctional families running it? Ferdinand and Isabella, the original power couple, had children, and these children were complicated. One daughter, Joanna, would later be known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Though in fairness, she seems mostly to have been mentally unwell in the way anyone might be after being surrounded by scheming nobles and an aggressively handsome husband. Her son, Charles the Thief, inherited Spain's rapidly expanding empire along with the Holy Roman Empire, becoming ruler of a realm so vast that people said the sun never set on it. Which sounds poetic until you imagine him trying to schedule meetings across 7 time zones with 16th-century mail. Delivery. Charles was brilliant, but exhausted. He had the weary look of a man who just wanted a nap but instead had to manage rebellions, treasure fleets, multiple wars, and a grandmother who talked to the mummified corpse of her dead husband. Yes, we'll get there, softly. Eventually, the empire that was too big for its own. Good Spain kept expanding, and expanding, and expanding. If someone pointed at land vaguely in the direction of the sunset, Spain claimed it. Half of South America? Theirs. Most of Central America? Theirs. The Philippines? Also theirs, because apparently the world was smaller in their imagination. Paperwork flooded the royal court. Maps clogged desks. Letters arrived months late, usually describing problems that would have been urgent 6 months ago. Ships sailed back to Spain carrying mountains of silver and gold, which sounds wonderful, until you realize that flooding Europe with treasure made prices skyrocket. Economies wobble, and kings develop a dangerous habit of declaring wars they could barely afford. But Spain kept going. More land, more colonies, more places. They'd eventually forget the exact location of the Spanish bureaucracy. A beautiful disaster. As the empire ballooned, Spain created a colossal bureaucracy to manage it. This involved offices, sub-offices, sub-sub-offices, and committees dedicated exclusively to arguing about how many committees were necessary. Royal scribes wrote so many documents that some cities ran out of parchment. Reports were copied, recopied, lost, rediscovered, and sometimes eaten by rats. One official once sent the same letter 4 times because the first 3 vanished somewhere between Panama and Madrid. The empire became like a very large closet where you keep stuffing things for later, until you eventually open it, and everything falls on top of you. And still, somehow, Spain acquired more land. By the 1500s, Spain had so much territory that even the monarchs didn't know where all of it was. A map maker once asked a royal minister to clarify the exact boundaries of a colony. The minister reportedly said, "Draw it where you think it should be." A refreshing honesty. the royal meltdowns that didn't help. Meanwhile, the Spanish royal family continued being itself. Charles V abdicated out of sheer exhaustion and retired to a monastery, finally achieving his lifelong dream of napping in peace. His son, Philip II, took over. Philip was pale, anxious, extremely Catholic, and had the expression of a man who disapproved of the furniture. He micromanaged everything: war strategy, colonial policy, even the color of court drapes. Naturally, things got worse. Under his watch, Spain reached its maximum size and then immediately began tripping over its own shoelaces. Philip launched expensive wars, some of which failed spectacularly, like the Spanish Armada, an event best described as a floating catastrophe encountering bad weather and worse planning. Yet even as Spain struggled, its empire stretched on, vast, wealthy, confusing, and held together mostly by inertia and paperwork. The beginning of the forgetting by the 1600s, Spain's empire was too large to administer properly. Colonies drifted, sometimes ignoring royal orders entirely. Governors acted like independent kings. Treasures disappeared en route. Maps contradicted each other. Spain kept receiving letters asking for help, funding, or recognition. Many of them sat unanswered because no one at court understood what the authors were talking about. At one point, a governor in South America complained that the king had forgotten his entire province existed. It took the crown 3 years to reply. By then, the governor had died. Slowly, gently, inevitably, the empire frayed like a tapestry too large to maintain. And that's where we leave Spain. For now Spain didn't lose its empire all at once. It misplaced it, one misunderstanding at a time, one overconfident expedition at a time, one royal crisis at a time. Local ranchers and small-town sheriffs began seeing strange lights darting across the desert night sky, objects moving too fast, too high, and too silently to be ordinary planes. And, since the idea of secret spy aircraft wasn't exactly public knowledge, the only logical explanation was aliens. Reports flooded in. Newspapers ran headlines about mysterious saucers over Nevada. The Air Force politely pretended not to know anything, but behind the scenes, every single UFO sighting near Area 51 was, in fact, just a test flight, usually a U-2, or later, the A-12 Oxcart, a plane so futuristic-looking it might as well have been designed by a child drawing a spaceship on a napkin. It ruled half the world. And then, gradually, forgot where half of it was. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the monarchs responsible for some of the strangest decisions ever made by people wearing crowns and velvet slippers. From the Habsburg jaw to royal nephews marrying their aunts, Spain's dynastic oddities deserve their own soft spotlight. But for now, breathe deeply and let the empire settle like dust on a quiet map. What happened to the children of fallen empires? The quiet after glory tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter kind of history. Not the rise and fall of empires themselves. There's been enough of that, but the quieter stories that come after the fall. The ones that happen when the banners are gone, the palace is empty, and the last heir of a mighty dynasty is standing in some damp exile, wondering what exactly to do now. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let's talk about what happens to the children of fallen empires. Because we always love a good empire, don't we? The rise, the power, the gold, the marble. But for every Caesar, there's a great-grandson sitting in a borrowed villa eating stale bread. History, you see, is full of the aftershocks. The minor royals who didn't die with their kingdoms, but had to live without them. It's not as glamorous, but it's deeply human. These are the princes who ended up teaching language in small universities. The princesses who married minor nobility in countries that couldn't pronounce their names. The children who were once bathed in perfume and fed with golden spoons, now selling off family jewels to buy a ticket to somewhere, anywhere, that would take them. Let's start with one of the grandest collapses of them all. The Romanovs. By 1917, they'd ruled Russia for 3 centuries. A family of divine autocrats, living in palaces so vast they could get lost inside them. And occasionally did. And then, suddenly, it all ended. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The empire dissolved into revolution. The family was imprisoned. And as we know, most of them never walked free again. But what's interesting, and rather haunting, is what happened to the ones outside Russia. Because there were a lot of Romanovs. Hundreds, actually. A family tree sprawling like ivy, full of cousins, uncles, and distant duchesses who'd been living comfortably across Europe. When the revolution came, they all realized, somewhat belatedly, that their last name was now a liability. Some fled under false identities. Some sold their jewels to survive. One of Nicholas's cousins, Grand Duke Dmitri, ended up in Paris, where he opened a perfume company. His most famous creation, Chanel No. 5. He helped Coco Chanel design it, and it became one of the best-selling perfumes in history. Romanov, once a man with a palace and servants, now bottling scent for a living. That's history for you. Others fared worse. Many lived out their days in quiet, shabby exile, in Nice or London, or small apartments in Belgium. They'd once commanded empires, and now they shared tea with other displaced aristocrats, telling stories about balls that no one could remember attending. It's a recurring theme. When empires fall, the grandeur doesn't vanish overnight. It just deflates slowly, like a very expensive cushion losing air. But let's drift a little further back. Long before the Romanovs were having their final tea, another set of imperial children were facing their own quiet extinction. The Byzantine emperors. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, it was the end of the Roman Empire, at least the eastern version of it, and the last emperor, Constantine X, died heroically on the city walls. But his relatives, they had to keep living. The surviving Palaiologos family, once rulers of the richest city in Christendom, scattered across Europe. Some fled to Venice, others to the Peloponnese. They wrote letters to Western kings asking for help, usually starting with, "Hello, I used to be emperor." The kings, understandably, didn't reply. Within a generation, the descendants of Byzantium's emperors were working as minor soldiers or bureaucrats in other people's courts. One Palaiologos even turned up in England in the 16th century, claiming to be a descendant of the Caesars, which was technically true if you didn't look too closely. He became a wine merchant in Cornwall, and that's a long way down from Constantinople. Once is fewn indeed, but the children of fallen empires weren't always so pitiful. Some learned to adapt, to reinvent themselves. Take the Mughals of India. They'd ruled one of the richest empires on earth. Peacocks, diamonds, the Taj Mahal, all that. Until the British East India Company slowly dismantled their power. By 1857, the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was an old man, living more like a poet than a ruler. When the Indian Rebellion broke out, both sides expected him to lead, but he barely had the energy to attend dinner. After the rebellion failed, the British exiled him to Burma. He died in a small, rented house. His descendants, once princes of the world's greatest empire, became clerks and school teachers. Some even joined the British civil service, working for the same empire that had destroyed their own. That's a particular kind of irony. The quiet, bureaucratic kind. Now, if we move west again, you'll find perhaps the most famous example of all. The French royal family after the Revolution. The Bourbons had ruled for centuries. Powdered wigs, Versailles, the works. And then, of course, came 1789, and everything began to unravel. King Louis XVI was executed. Queen Marie Antoinette followed. Their son, the Dauphin, was locked in a tower. A small boy left to die slowly of neglect. But a few Bourbons survived. And they became, essentially, Europe's most awkward dinner guests. The exiled French royals spent decades drifting between foreign courts, where they were treated with polite discomfort. They had no country, no income, and no clear purpose, so they did what any displaced aristocrats would do. They bickered with each other about whose claim was most legitimate. It's a time-honored tradition among the unemployed. One Bourbon princess, Madame Royale, the daughter of Louis XVI, was eventually allowed to return to France. But when she arrived, she found her family's palaces looted, her titles meaningless, and her people largely indifferent. She lived in quiet bitterness, writing long letters about how everything had gone wrong. And really, that's the recurring theme of this entire story. Generations of people writing letters about how everything had gone wrong. But sometimes, the fall of an empire gave its children an unexpected freedom. Once the crown was gone, they could, finally, live like ordinary people. Or at least try to. One of the Habsburgs, the family that once ruled half of Europe, became a race car driver in the 20th century. His name was Otto von Habsburg. He was born in a palace, educated by monarchists, and ended up giving political interviews from the driver's seat of a sports car. Another Habsburg joined the European Parliament, which, if you think about it, is a very diplomatic way of trying to rebuild an empire, just with better lighting and fewer wars. Sometimes, though the fall came too fast for adaptation. When Napoleon's empire collapsed, his relatives scattered like startled pigeons. His brother Joseph, briefly king of Spain, escaped to America and lived in New Jersey. Yes, that New Jersey. He built a mansion in Bordentown, called himself the Count of Surprises, and held elaborate dinners for curious Americans who'd heard of his famous brother. He became a minor celebrity, a sort of European curiosity. There's something charming about that. An ex-king politely explaining to his guests how to hold a fork properly, while secretly wishing he still had a throne. His nephew, Napoleon III, actually managed a comeback, becoming Emperor of the French in 1852. For about 20 years, he ruled with moderate success, until he, too, was overthrown. He fled to England and died in exile, as French emperors seem contractually obliged to do. His only son, the Prince Imperial, tried to restore the family's glory by joining the British Army. He was promptly killed in the Anglo-Zulu War, which, if we're being honest, feels like history's way of saying enough Napoleons for now. Sometimes, the children of fallen empires simply vanished into legend. After the fall of the Aztec Empire, many of the royal descendants of Montezuma were taken into Spanish custody. A few were granted small estates in Spain. By the 18th century, they'd become Spanish nobles, still bearing the blood of the Aztec emperors, but now wearing powdered wigs and attending Madrid balls. And somewhere in the archives, there's a record of a Count of Moctezuma drawing a royal pension, a faint echo of a world long gone. It's strange, isn't it? How empires dissolve, but their DNA keeps turning up at garden parties centuries later. And that's what's oddly comforting about this kind of history. For all the grand collapses, the battles, revolutions and declarations. What comes after is so human. Children who have to find work, families that downsize, princes who start small businesses. It's the universal postscript of history. And then they had to get on with it. There are records of abbesses maintaining personal maids, hunting dogs, and even private gardens. At least one German abbess in the 15th century was caught wearing ermine. When questioned, she explained serenely that it was to honor God with beauty. A bold answer, and probably warm. Earthy, oily, smoky, a mix of wool, leather, sweat, and herbs. The scent of wood smoke in hair, of horses and tallow candles, of damp linen dried too close to the fire. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the quiet after the empire, a once golden palace, its windows dark, a single candle burning in an attic room, where a forgotten prince is writing a letter to someone who will never reply. Outside, the city hums on, indifferent, and inside, the child of empire dreams not of conquest, but of something simpler. A home, a meal, a little peace. Because even the heirs of greatness eventually just want to rest. What did people smell like before soap was common? Tonight, we're drifting back to a simpler, less hygienic time, a time before lavender shampoos, before foaming cleansers, before the very concept of freshness was something a person could aspire to. Tonight, we're asking one of those quietly horrifying but oddly comforting questions. What did people actually smell like before soap was common? Because somewhere in the back of your mind, you've wondered. You've looked at portraits of medieval kings, resplendent in velvet and gold thread, and thought, yes, but underneath all that, there must have been a certain musk. And you'd be right. But let's not rush. Let's drift slowly through the centuries, through the perfumes, the bathhouses, the dubious medical theories, and the overwhelming belief that water itself might kill you. Because the truth is, human cleanliness has never been a straight line. It's more of a gentle wobble between reasonably pleasant and please open a window. Now, the word soap itself is ancient. The earliest recipe we know of comes from the Babylonians, around 2800 BCE. They mixed animal fat with wood ash, a combination that's as thrilling to the nose as it sounds, and produced a kind of grayish paste. It wasn't for beauty, though it was for cleaning wool and cloth, not bodies. In fact, for much of human history, soap was seen as a sort of industrial substance, something used by dyers, not duchesses. As far as personal hygiene went, people relied on water, sand, oil, or sheer optimism. Let's drift to ancient Rome, because of course we're going to Rome. The Romans were famously clean, or at least they thought they were. Bathing was practically a civic duty. Every city had bathhouses, steaming, echoing halls filled with marble pools, slaves carrying towels, and men loudly discussing politics while naked. Soap, however, still wasn't a thing. Instead, Romans would rub oil onto their skin, often olive oil, occasionally mixed with something aromatic, and then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. Imagine replacing your shower with a daily oiling and scraping ritual. Congratulations! You're now a senator. The result was mixed. You'd remove dirt, yes, but you'd also create a kind of lingering, warm, human stew smell. And with hundreds of people bathing together in hot, moist air, well, the atmosphere was less spa day and more slightly alarming soup. Still, the Romans believed in cleanliness as a virtue, which makes it all the more interesting that when their empire fell, everyone promptly gave up on it. Because by the early Middle Ages, the communal bathhouse had become suspicious. Anything Roman was now viewed as a little decadent, a little pagan. And bathing, with all that nakedness and steamy conversation, looked dangerously sinful. By the 9th century, most Europeans had abandoned regular bathing altogether. Instead, they turned to linen. Fresh linen, you see, was the medieval deodorant. If you couldn't wash your body, you could at least wash your shirt. The theory was that clean fabric drew impurities out of the skin, a kind of osmosis of cleanliness. So, a well-laundered nobleman might smell faintly of linen, wine, horses, and despair. But at least he felt virtuous about it. This was also when people began to fear water itself. Doctors insisted that bathing opened the pores, which sounds good until you remember they believed disease entered through those pores like burglars through an unlocked door. So if you bathed too often, you weren't just vain, you were asking to die. This logic became so entrenched that some people went decades without washing their bodies. There are records of French kings, several of them, who bathed. Fewer times in their lives than you've bathed this month. Louis XIII, for instance, took only a handful of baths. He preferred to have his servants wipe him down with scented cloths instead. His physicians even advised against water entirely, so he covered the problem with gallons of perfume. It said the sun. King's palace at Versailles smelled of roses, amber, and the faint suggestion of human neglect. Perfume, in fact, became Europe's answer to the smell problem. By the Renaissance, everyone with money was dousing themselves in it. Civet from the glands of a cat-like animal, musk from deer, ambergris from the intestines of whales, all the finest biological substances nature could provide. The richer you were, the more you smelled like the inside of a perfume workshop. And while these scents were expensive and powerful, they didn't so much mask body odor as wrestle with it. Two strong forces locked in eternal combat, right there on a royal sleeve. But not all parts of the world were avoiding cleanliness. While medieval Europe recoiled from its own pores, the Islamic world was thriving in both science and soap-making. In the Middle East, people bathed regularly. Public bathhouses, hammams, were social and spiritual spaces, and soap, made from olive oil and lye, was an everyday household product. By the 8th century, Arabic chemists had perfected solid bars of scented soap, the kind that would one day inspire the word savon. So, yes, while European nobles were dabbing themselves with cloths and pretending it counted, people in Damascus and Cairo were quietly enjoying an actual, refreshing bath. It's one of those moments in history where geography directly determined how bearable you were to stand next to. You see, den Reuters, soap eventually made its way back to Europe during the Crusades, which is ironic, considering the Crusaders were supposedly bringing back holiness and instead rediscovered basic hygiene. By the 12th century, Italian merchants in places like Savona and Marseille were producing soap commercially. But it was still a luxury good, something for nobles, not peasants. Ordinary people might wash in rivers or with sand, or simply wait for rain. The concept of smelling nice was reserved for those who could afford to outsource the problem to servants. Now, before we go any further, let's talk about teeth, because the mouth, unfortunately, was part of this same olfactory disaster. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't appear in Europe until the 17th century. Before that, people used twigs, cloth, or their fingers. Tooth powder existed, but the ingredients were unpredictable. Crushed shells, charcoal, salt, even powdered bone. So if the smell didn't bother you, the dental erosion certainly would. And mouthwash? Wine, occasionally vinegar. Essentially, whatever liquid you had nearby, it's amazing anyone kissed at all. Really. By the 1500s, the wealthy were still not bathing often, but they looked cleaner, thanks to layers of silk, lace, and a small army of servants dedicated to brushing, powdering, and scenting every visible inch of them. One ambassador in Henry VIII's court described the English as the filthiest nation of all, which, coming from a 16th century European, was a serious insult. Henry himself bathed occasionally, usually before seduction or diplomacy, but the Tudors still considered overbathing a sign of weakness. When Elizabeth of Infurven became queen, she famously claimed to bathe once a month. Whether she needed it or not, it was meant as a joke, but also it probably wasn't. Still, she adored perfume. The Elizabethan court was a festival of scent. Amber, rose water, and the faint undertone of everyone's digestive systems quietly struggling with a diet of meat and ale. One of her favorites was Hungary water, a mixture of rosemary, thyme, and alcohol. It was applied to skin, clothes, even gloves. The goal wasn't cleanliness, just the illusion of it. In that sense, not much has changed. Let's drift softly now to the 17th century, when something remarkable began to happen. Soap became fashionable again. Chemistry had improved. Trade had expanded. And for the first time in centuries, people were beginning to think that smelling pleasant might be better than smelling pious. In France, the city of Marseille became the heart of European soap-making. Savon de Marseille, white, hard, and gently scented, became a status symbol. Still, soap was taxed as a luxury item until well into the 1800s. It wasn't until industrial production made it cheap that ordinary people began using it daily. Before that, the poor washed rarely, if at all. The rich pretended they didn't need to, and the middle class tried very hard to convince themselves that wiping was as good as bathing. You can imagine the general atmosphere of a crowded 18th century street, tanneries, fish stalls, human waste, horses everywhere, perfume and sweat and smoke blending into what one writer simply called the miasma. People carried pomanders, small balls of herbs and spices, to hold under their noses. Essentially, portable air fresheners, because the entire world, it seemed, smelled faintly alive. By the 19th century, things were beginning to shift. Industrialization brought running water, sewage systems, and, finally, affordable soap. Cleanliness became a moral virtue again. This time backed by science instead of superstition, Victorians loved to appear spotless. But hot water was expensive. So many bathed only weekly, or on Sundays, as if washing were a kind of worship. Soap itself was still evolving. Early bars were harsh and lie-heavy, capable of removing both dirt and dignity. Only in the early 20th century did companies like Palmolive and Lever begin creating milder, perfumed soaps for daily use. And with that, humanity finally smelled tolerable. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine it, a candle-lit room in medieval Paris. The air thick with herbs and humanity. Someone pulling on a clean linen shirt and feeling, briefly, immaculate. Outside, the world smells alive, and for them, that's exactly how it should. What did people actually eat during a famine? Tonight, we're drifting back to a world without supermarkets, or takeaway, or anything resembling just popping out for groceries. We're going to the centuries when hunger wasn't an inconvenience. It was the background noise of life. When the crops failed and winter lingered and the sky felt just a little too gray, people did what they always do when they have to survive. They got creative, sometimes ingenious, sometimes horrifyingly so. So, settle in, maybe have a small snack before we begin. It'll make the journey a little more comfortable. Because tonight we're drifting back to ask, what did people actually eat during a famine? A world built on bread before we start gnawing on bark or imagining rat stew. It's worth remembering that for most of history, food was astonishingly simple. Bread wasn't a side dish. It was the meal. If you were lucky, you might get a bit of cheese, a scrap of salted fish, or a cup of ale to wash it down. So when famine hit, it wasn't just hunger. It was the collapse of the one thing people understood about life, that bread would be there. Medieval Europeans even prayed for it daily, literally, in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. It wasn't metaphorical. They meant it. So when the wheat harvest failed, it wasn't a crisis of convenience. It was an existential one, because bread wasn't just food. It was identity, order, and religion baked into one small loaf. When it disappeared, people turned to other options. The Great Famine of 1317, let's drift first to early 14th century Europe, a time before the Black Death, but still spectacularly miserable. It began with rain. It always begins with rain. From 13 to 15 onward, relentless downpours drowned fields across northern Europe. Crops rotted. Livestock starved, grain reserves molded, and because medieval supply chains were about as efficient as a mule on ice skates, local shortages quickly became continental disasters. Chroniclers tell us of families eating horses, dogs, and, on rare occasions, things best left unnamed. You know it's bad when the chronicler politely skips the details. In some towns, people made what they called famine bread, a sort of culinary protest against starvation. Grain was padded out with anything remotely edible. Ground-up tree bark, acorns, moss, and even sawdust. The result was a loaf so hard it could chip teeth, and so indigestible it could, and did, kill people who ate too much of it. Because of course it did. Bread of bark and bones. Bark bread was an invention born in crisis, but surprisingly widespread. In Scandinavia, it persisted even outside famine years. The inner bark of pine or birch trees, the soft layer just beneath the rough exterior, was scraped off, dried, and ground into a grayish powder, mixed with a bit of rye flour. It became a sort of fibrous, tragic bread substitute. It didn't taste good, and it didn't fill you up. but it kept people alive just long enough to regret it. In some places, bones were crushed and mixed into flour. Sometimes animal bones, sometimes not specified. They added a bit of calcium, technically, though I doubt that was the intention. And then there was bran bread, made mostly from the husks and chaff of grain, the parts people normally fed to pigs. During famine, humans became their own livestock. They ate what they could digest and prayed that it would be enough to get through the week. The moral panic of hunger famine wasn't just physical suffering. It was moral chaos, because hunger changes people. And when food becomes scarce, everyone starts looking suspiciously at everyone else. In 1317, a chronicler in France wrote that travelers feared being eaten on the road. He didn't say it happened often, but the rumor alone was enough to keep people indoors. Villages whispered about bakers hoarding grain, priests hiding wine, nobles feasting in secret. And sometimes they were right. The upper classes didn't always starve. They had stores of food, salted meats, imported grain, and they guarded it fiercely. So while peasants gnawed on bark, nobles dined on venison and fish, and congratulated themselves on their providence. It wasn't elegant, but it was very human. Let's drift east while Europe was learning to chew trees. Russia had its own periodic descents into hunger. In the 1600s, a particularly bad famine hit during the Time of Troubles, an era when even the czars didn't know who was in charge from one week to the next. Reports say that the streets of Moscow were littered with the dead. Bread was made from straw, and when that ran out, they turned to cats, dogs, and the occasional shoe-leather stew. One observer noted, with the weary understatement of the century, that men grew desperate and strange. And really, who could blame them? The Irish famine, starvation in an age of empire. But perhaps the most infamous famine, the one etched deepest into Western memory, is the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. Though centuries later than our medieval bark eaters, it followed the same pattern. One crop, one failure, millions of lives undone. When the potato blight struck, Ireland was still under British rule. The Irish poor relied almost entirely on the potato for sustenance. It was cheap, filling, and astonishingly nutritious for something that grows in mud. But when the blight hit, it spread like gossip, fields blackened, potatoes turned to sludge underground. And while the Irish starved, food continued to leave the island, exported to Britain, because contracts were contracts, which is one of history's more horrifying examples of paperwork outweighing humanity. People ate grass. They boiled nettles. Some, in sheer despair, were found with green-stained mouths, having eaten anything that grew near their cottages. Workhouses overflowed, emigration soared, and within a few years Ireland lost a quarter of its population, either to death or to flight. It's strange to think that a single plant could hold up a civilization, and stranger still to see what happens when it collapses. 100. Medieval culinary innovation back in the Middle Ages. Famine wasn't unusual. It was cyclical. Good harvests alternated with bad ones, like the rhythm of the seasons. So, people got inventive. If food ran short, they knew the drill. In England, for instance, peasants made pottage, a sort of endlessly simmering stew that could absorb whatever was available. On a good day, that meant onions, cabbage, maybe a shred of bacon. On a bad day, it meant weeds, roots, and the occasional snail. There's even record of a dish called famine stew in late medieval Germany, essentially boiled grass thickened with flour. It had the remarkable property of tasting like absolutely nothing. Milk was diluted, cheese stretched thin, and ale watered down until it barely qualified as liquid. Children were given soup, stones, literally smooth stones boiled in water, so they could pretend there was food coming. It was psychological. Comfort disguised as dinner. Famine and faith hunger always came with theology attached. In medieval Europe, famine was seen as divine punishment, a test, or a sign of collective sin. So, naturally, people prayed. They held processions, confessed, and fasted, which is, admittedly, redundant during a famine. But it made sense to them. If food came from God, then hunger must have been sent by him too. In some towns, desperate people turned on outsiders, Jews, foreigners, or supposed witches, blaming them for crop failures. It was easier to find a scapegoat than to face the randomness of weather. So famine bred not just hunger, but paranoia. A full stomach, it seems, has always been a prerequisite for tolerance. Animals, then not? It's easy to forget how important livestock were. Cows, sheep, and pigs weren't just food. They were wealth, insurance, and future sustenance. So, in famine, eating your animals was both a last resort and a moral dilemma. Kill the cow, and you survive today. Keep it alive, and you might survive the year. Either way, you lost something vital. In many records, you can trace the progression of desperation by the meat consumed. First, go the chickens, then the pigs, then dogs, then horses, whose meat was usually taboo in Christian Europe. By the time people were boiling their boots, you knew the village had reached the end of the line. And after that, well, chroniclers start to fall silent. Let's drift south. The famine in France. In 1709, France endured what's now called the Great Winter. Temperatures dropped so low that birds froze mid-flight and fell from the sky. Rivers turned solid. Vineyards died. Bread prices soared. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was still sitting on his throne of gold, but the kingdom beneath him starved. Grain hoarding became a national scandal. And, as always, the poor were told to eat potatoes, though in many places they hadn't even heard of them yet. So they ate grass again. They boiled nettles. They made bread from powdered oak bark. And when that failed, they died quietly, as peasants were expected to do. The king reportedly ordered special soup kitchens to be opened. But they served thin broth to thousands, not bread to millions. The symbolism was exquisite. So what did people smell like before soap was common? When we try to imagine them now, we forget that we're smelling through centuries of soap. So as we drift through this grim, quiet gallery of famine meals, bark bread, bone flour, grass soup, it's worth remembering that behind every recipe was a human life trying to hold on. Every bite was an act of defiance, even if it didn't taste like much. Let's drift, in the next part, to how governments, monarchs, and empires responded to famine, or didn't, and how hunger shaped revolutions, policies, and history itself. How did medieval people actually smell? Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world that looks beautiful in paintings, but probably didn't smell like one. A world of velvet gowns, carved wooden halls, flickering candlelight, and a hint of something else, something earthy, something human. So, tuck in, settle your mind, and let's float back to the Middle Ages, where perfume met pigsty, and no one could quite agree on whether bathing was holy, sinful, or just terribly inconvenient. The question we're gently poking at tonight is, how did medieval people actually smell? Because if you've ever watched a historical drama, all golden light and clean linen, you might imagine everyone wafting about like rose water and sandalwood. But reality had a more complex bouquet. Let's just say that, if time travel were real, you'd want to bring nose plugs to understand the smell of medieval life. We need to remember what created it: the cities, the homes, the people, and all the wonderfully unhygienic things they did there. Let's start with the cities. The scent of civilization. Medieval towns were, in a word, compact. If you've ever lived in a cramped apartment where someone insists on cooking fish at 2 a.m., you already understand the basic concept. Cities like London, Paris, or Cologne were built long before the concept of urban planning. Streets were narrow, winding, and usually paved not with cobblestone, but with, well, everything else. Mud, hay, straw, rotting food, animal waste, and the occasional dead rat, all mashed together in a sort of fragrant historical soup. People threw their trash directly into the street, chamber pots too. So when it rained, and it rained often, everything was stirred up nicely and redistributed evenly underfoot. Medieval weather, it turns out, was nature's air freshener, though not a very successful one. And then, of course, there were the tanneries. Every respectable medieval town needed a few. Tanning leather meant soaking animal hides in vats of water, urine, and lime. Some tanners even used dog feces for the chemical reaction it caused. So, yes, if you lived downwind from the tannery, you didn't need a calendar. You could tell the time of day by the smell alone. Still, people lived, worked, and even courted each other in these places. So either they had an incredible tolerance, or perhaps everyone just smelled equally bad, and therefore no one noticed, which is quite an elegant form of social equality when you think about it. Cleanliness, next to godliness, or not. Now, about bathing. Here's where the story gets interesting, and surprisingly inconsistent. For much of early medieval Europe, bathing was actually encouraged. In the early Middle Ages, think around the time of Charlemagne, bathhouses were common, public ones even. People would gather in large wooden tubs, steam themselves in hot water, and sometimes enjoy a mug of ale while they did it. In fact, monasteries often had bathing rooms, and monks were permitted several baths a year, though several meant anywhere between 4 and 12, depending on the century, which sounds grim until you realize that peasants might not have had even that. But things changed. As the centuries rolled on, particularly after the 14th century, public bathing fell out of favor. The church began to associate bathhouses with sin, and not entirely without reason. Many bathhouses doubled as, shall we say, social clubs. By the late Middle Ages, the logic went something like this. Bathhouses are places of temptation. Temptation leads to sin. Therefore, water itself becomes suspicious. Some even believed that bathing too often opened the pores and let disease seep in, which, considering the Black Death, was not entirely unreasonable, though tragically backward. So instead of washing, people began layering on clothing and scent. The aristocratic bouquet, royalty, of course, were a special case. They might have been surrounded by servants and silks, but when it came to hygiene, they were often no better off. In fact, some were worse. Take Queen Elizabeth. She reigned in the late 1500s, technically after the medieval period. But her habits reflect the long-standing European attitude toward washing. Elizabeth was famously proud of her pale complexion and powdered skin, but she bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. And when plague outbreaks came near London, she ordered the removal of all water near her residences, believing it carried disease, which it sometimes did. But her solution didn't help much either. Instead of bathing, people dusted themselves with powders and perfumes. Rose water, lavender, ambergris, which, by the way, is whale vomit. They even perfumed their gloves, their hair, and their handkerchiefs, creating a kind of moving cloud of fragrance that tried, and mostly failed, to outcompete the rest of the medieval world. Perfume was not just a luxury. It was survival. The wealthy carried pomanders, little metal spheres filled with herbs and resins, to sniff whenever the air got aggressive, which, in a medieval city, was most of the time. But even with perfume, the royal world wasn't much cleaner. Henry VIII, for example, kept servants whose job was literally to wipe him. They were called grooms of the stool. It was considered an intimate, trusted position, which tells you everything about the priorities of Tudor hygiene. The same king had a fondness for rich meats, sugar and wine, and his later years were marked by open-leg ulcers. Imagine that, in an age without deodorant or antiseptic, yet court chroniclers still called him majestic. It seems history's sense of smell has always been forgiving. The peasant's soapless reality for peasants, the vast majority of the population, hygiene was largely a matter of practicality. They worked outdoors, with animals, in dirt, and in weather that didn't much encourage a pleasant bath. They might wash their hands and face in a basin, maybe rinse their feet. But full-body bathing was a rare event, usually reserved for special days like Easter or Christmas. Soap existed, but it was harsh, expensive, and often made from animal fat and lye. If it touched your skin too often, you'd wish it hadn't. Still, not every peasant walked around caked in filth. Many rural people took pride in neatness, combing hair, washing linens in streams, using herbs like rosemary or sage to scent themselves. It wasn't luxury, but it was effort, and in a world where survival left little time for comfort, effort counted. The smells of daily life. To imagine the scent of medieval life, you need to combine everything: the streets, the kitchens, the bodies, the animals, the firewood, and the latrines, all swirling together in one continuous atmosphere. In winter, homes were heated by wood or peat fires. The smoke clung to clothing, hair, and furniture. Most houses didn't have chimneys until the late Middle Ages, so the smoke simply filled the room until it found an exit. That constant haze left everyone smelling faintly of smoke, which, honestly, might have been one of the better aromas available. Add to that the smell of tallow candles, which were made from animal fat. When burned, they released a rich, meaty scent. like a perpetual stew of beef and regret. Combine that with unwashed wool, wet boots, and damp straw floors, and you get an olfactory experience that could never be recreated by even the most committed historical reenactor. Yet, for the people who lived in it, that was simply home. Smell is relative. When everyone and everything around you smells the same, it ceases to be unpleasant. It just is. A world without fresh. The modern idea of freshness, crisp air, clean linen, the sterile scent of soap, simply didn't exist. Clean meant visible cleanliness. No mud, no stains, no lice. Linen shirts were the medieval secret weapon. They absorbed sweat and grime and could be boiled clean. A nobleman might go through several fresh linen undershirts a day, not because he was bathing, but because he wasn't. This was the illusion of cleanliness. Spotless linen, covering an unwashed body. It worked surprisingly well. So well, in fact, that by the late Middle Ages, the phrase clean linen became synonymous with virtue. If your linens were white, you were a good Christian. If they weren't, well, you might be hiding sin. Clothes did what baths did not. And perhaps that's why portraits of medieval nobles always show them in shimmering, pristine garments, not because they were freshly scrubbed, but because they were visually sanitized for history. Saints, sinners, and the scent of holiness. There was also, strangely, a spiritual dimension to smell. For medieval Christians, scent was more than hygiene. It was theology. Bad smells were thought to indicate sin. A stinking body might reflect a stinking soul. Meanwhile, saints were said to emit the odor of sanctity, literally a sweet smell, like flowers or incense, emanating from their bodies after death. It's difficult to say whether these scents were real or imagined, but believers recorded them earnestly. When Saint Teresa died, witnesses swore the room filled with the aroma of roses. By contrast, the corpses of sinners were said to reek. Proof, supposedly, of divine displeasure. So, in a way, smell itself was a kind of spiritual signal. One's odor might testify to one's soul, which puts a rather existential twist on the whole question of hygiene. It was the beginning of the modern era of bathing, and the slow death of the natural human aroma. Still, even then, it wasn't universal. And yet, even with all the filth, the disease, and the complete lack of soap commercials, people somehow managed to fall in love, write poetry, and survive long enough to give us modern plumbing. How did medieval nuns rebel without breaking their vows? A cloistered beginning tonight? We're drifting back behind stone walls and candlelight to a world that was supposed to be silent, holy, and pure. But, being human, it very much wasn't. We're going inside the medieval convent. It's a place you might imagine as still and serene. Women in habits moving soundlessly through cloisters, hands folded, eyes downcast, chanting in gentle harmony. And yes, sometimes that was true, but just as often it was a community of politics, gossip, secret snacks, and very creative interpretations of the rules. Because medieval nuns, like all people who live under too many restrictions, found ingenious ways to rebel. They had to. Their vows were absolute. Obedience, chastity, and poverty. No leaving the grounds without permission. No contact with men. No luxury. No fun. So, naturally, they found ways around all of it. Let's start with the basics of convent life. Most women didn't choose to become nuns out of deep personal conviction. A few did, and they became saints or mystics, which we'll get to later. But the majority were simply placed there. If you were a noble family with too many daughters, the convent was your solution. One daughter to marry for politics, one for alliance, and one, usually the least socially useful, sent off to God. It was a tidy way to handle inheritance laws. A noblewoman who became a nun couldn't claim property or titles. So, by sending a few spare daughters to a convent, you conveniently kept your estates from being divided. And of course, it was cheaper than a wedding. So, from the start, many convents were full of women who didn't particularly want to be there. And boredom, as always, is the mother of invention. Picture it. Stone walls, a cold dormitory, bells ringing before dawn, prayers at 2 a.m. Retreat again at 5, again at noon. Then more prayers after that. Meals of pottage, basically gray stew, eaten in silence. And through all this, the one constant thought, there must be something else to do. So they found things. Some convents became secret workshops of art, embroidery, and music, all technically allowed, but often carried out with a little more flair than the bishops approved of. Others were quiet centers of letter-writing, gossip networks, and, occasionally, smuggling rings. Yes, smuggling rings. Because when you wall off a group of clever women, they will find tunnels. Let's drift first to England in the 14th century. The nuns of Wilton Abbey were famous for their piety and for having an impressive collection of fine gowns. So impressive, in fact, that visiting inspectors frequently complained they couldn't tell the choir from the court. They wore colorful dresses under their habits, secretly dyed in shades of blue and red, jewelry tucked into sleeves, perfumed oil hidden under the altar cloths. And when the bishop arrived for inspection, everything suddenly smelled very holy indeed. He might have noticed the silk hems peeking out beneath the habits, but, conveniently, no one was looking down. Then there was the matter of visitors. Convents were supposed to be enclosed, but walls have doors, and doors have keys, and keys have creative uses. Most nuns' families would send letters, gifts, or food delivered by male servants, and those servants occasionally stayed for dinner, or longer. Records from Episcopal, visitations, That's when bishops inspected. Convents show frequent complaints about unauthorized male presence. The term covered everything from a cousin visiting for tea to a local troubadour who somehow spent the night. In one convent in France, the bishop discovered that several nuns had been sneaking out to attend local festivals. Their excuse? They wanted to observe the faith of the common people. A noble thought, perhaps, though it was quickly followed by a small riot when the bishop tried to discipline them. And yet, for all their mischief, these women weren't villains. They were clever survivors inside a rigid system. The convent was one of the only institutions that gave women education, resources, and community. So many nuns used that space to create something of their own, even if it meant bending a few vows. Take Hildegard of Bingen, for example. She entered a convent as a child, grew up behind its walls, and eventually became its abbess. She was a visionary, literally. She claimed divine revelations, which she used to write books, compose music, and advise emperors. But what's interesting is how she got away with it. Technically, women weren't supposed to preach or write theology, but Hildegard simply did. She called her visions messages from God, and since no bishop wanted to contradict God, her writings were accepted. Clever move. It's rebellion cloaked in holiness, the safest kind of rebellion there is. Let's wander north to the Low countries, today's Belgium and the Netherlands, where another kind of female community began to appear. The Beguines. They weren't quite nuns. They lived together, took simple vows, and did charitable work. But they didn't swear lifelong obedience, and they could leave whenever they liked. In short, they invented the medieval version of independent women's housing. Naturally, the church was confused and mildly offended. The Beguines weren't breaking rules, but they weren't following them either. They existed in the cracks of the system. Women devoted to faith, but not controlled by it. Their little communities became places of art, writing, and education. Some Beguines ran small businesses, others taught children, and quite a few wrote love poetry to God that was suspiciously romantic. You could call it spiritual ecstasy, or you could call it a loophole. Meanwhile, inside stricter convents, rebellion took subtler forms. There were forbidden books passed hand to hand, secret recipes for better meals, quiet music sung after curfew, and occasionally more dramatic episodes, like the nuns of Poitiers, who in 589 turned their convent into something between a fortress and a soap opera. Their abbess was deposed by royal decree. The nuns revolted, barricaded the chapel, and took up weapons. When the king's troops broke in, they found the sisters throwing stones and shouting curses. It took several days to restore order. The official record called it an outbreak of hysteria, which is, of course, how men often describe women who disagree with them. But let's not imagine that all convents were chaos. Many were peaceful, even prosperous. Some abbesses managed their estates better than most barons. In England, the Abbess of Shaftesbury controlled lands across several counties and employed dozens of servants. Her convent had its own bakery, brewery, and fish ponds. And yes, the sisters drank beer, the safer alternative to water. The Church tolerated moderate alcohol consumption, which medieval people took to mean as much as you can carry back to bed. So when the evening bell rang, some nuns were already quietly tipsy on their small ale. It wasn't quite rebellion, but it made Vespers more pleasant. The most fascinating part, though, is how these women's inner lives often come through their letters and marginal notes, the little scribbles in the margins of prayer books. You'll find prayers, yes, but also notes like, "Pray for my cousin who owes me a chicken," or, "The sister who sits beside me sings terribly." One English nun doodled cats in the margins of her psalter. Another added recipes for cough syrup. And in a book owned by a 13th-century convent, one sister wrote, "Do not trust Sister Alice with the butter." We don't know what Alice did, but clearly it was memorable. If we drift for a moment to southern Germany, we'll find the convent of Unterlinden, where the nuns specialized in manuscript illumination. They painted saints and angels in gold and ultramarine. But occasionally, hidden in the corners, you'll find tiny jokes. A nun chasing a goose, or a mischievous monk peeking over a wall. It's not defiance. It's humanity leaking through the cracks of devotion. And then there were the mystics. Women like Marjorie Kempe, who claimed divine vision so dramatic they bordered on performance art. She wasn't technically a nun, but she lived much like one, traveling in a white robe and crying loudly about Jesus. Her local priest found her exhausting. Her neighbors thought she was mad. But Marjorie simply called herself God's creature and wrote the first known autobiography in English. Her story reminds us that medieval spirituality was often intensely personal and sometimes deeply inconvenient for everyone else. In convents, mysticism could be both an outlet and a weapon. A nun who claimed divine visions suddenly had authority, not from her abbess or her bishop, but directly from heaven. And some used that authority to criticize corruption in the church, to promote female education, or to quietly negotiate better treatment for their sisters. So, even within obedience, there was resistance. Now, not every act of rebellion was so noble. Some were simply practical. In many convents, the vow of poverty was interpreted loosely. Technically, no individual nun could own property, but the convent could. And if you happened to be in charge of the convent's purse, well, you could make life quite comfortable. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, imagine a medieval convent after sunset. The corridors are dark. The bells are silent. And in one small cell, a candle flickers over a piece of parchment. A nun is writing. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a letter she shouldn't be writing. Maybe it's a recipe. And outside, beyond the walls, the world goes on. Loud, messy, and unholy. While inside, she smiles quietly to herself, because even within vows of silence, she's found her voice. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? The hangman's quiet days tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval life, or, at least, a quieter kind of grim. So, dim the lights. Let the world soften a little, and let's talk about a man who only worked when someone died. The medieval executioner. Now, this is one of those professions everyone remembers in broad strokes. The hood, the axe, maybe a few dramatic swings. But that's not really the whole picture, because the job, like most medieval jobs, was both more boring and more complicated than the legends make it sound. You see, executioners didn't actually execute people very often. In a small medieval town, there might only be a handful of hangings, beheadings, or burnings each year, which left these men with the awkward question: what exactly do you do for the rest of the time? It's a fair question, and, surprisingly, we have the answer. The medieval executioner was, in many ways, the local handyman of human misery. When he wasn't killing people, he was cleaning things up, sometimes literally. Let's start with the basics. Most executioners didn't choose the job. It chose them, in the same way a falling anvil chooses someone in a cartoon. Often, the role was hereditary. If your father was an executioner, congratulations. You probably were, too. And if you refused, you'd be exiled or punished because someone had to do it, and your family was already tainted by the trade. Executioners were officially employed by towns or cities, given a wage, a place to live, and certain privileges. But socially, they were considered untouchable. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't enter many taverns or churches. In some places, they had to sit on their own benches during Mass, as if sin could be caught by proximity. So imagine that. You have one of the most essential jobs in town, enforcing law and order, and yet no one will shake your hand. Even your coins, after a hanging, might be avoided, because they were thought to carry a kind of spiritual contamination. But that same contamination had its perks. Executioners were feared, respected in a dark way, and in the strange logic of medieval society, their cursed hands were also believed to heal. When there were no executions to perform, many hangmen worked as healers. It sounds ironic, the bringer of death as the giver of life. But medieval medicine was full of contradictions like that. The belief went that since the executioner had contact with death, he could harness that power to cure disease, especially skin ailments or swellings, so people, often secretly, would come to the executioner's house after dark. They'd ask for the hangman's hand, literally. They wanted to be touched by it. The touch of the executioner's hand, it was said, could drive away evil spirits or cure warts. There are records of hangmen selling salves and potions, sometimes made from the fat of the executed, which is as macabre as it sounds. It wasn't considered witchcraft, just unconventional medicine, and it was, to be fair, probably one of the few side businesses available when you couldn't exactly join the local apothecaries' guild. In the German towns of the 15th and 16th centuries, where we have the best records, the executioner often served as the town cleaner as well. When no one was being hanged, he was expected to remove dead animals from the streets, to shovel away waste, to wash the gallows, and sometimes to perform the charming task of disposing of sewage or corpses after plagues. In other words, the executioner was both public servant and public pariah. His official title in places like Nuremberg or Augsburg might be something grand like Master of Justice, but everyone still called him the hangman. The job came with a peculiar set of perks: free housing, exemption from certain taxes, and the right to sell less than fresh meat. Because, yes, one of the executioner's legal privileges was the right to take the bodies of executed criminals, strip them of their clothes, and sell them. And in some towns, they also collected stray animals, butchered them, and sold that meat, too. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Let's drift for a moment to France, where the king's executioner, the bourreau, had a slightly more prestigious life. These were professionals, working for the crown. The most famous line of them all was the Sanson family of Paris. 7 generations of executioners who served the monarchy, and then, rather awkwardly, the Revolution. But even at that higher level, the social stigma remained. The Sansons were paid well, but they were shunned. They couldn't attend court events. Their children had trouble marrying outside their own family, and so many executioners married the daughters of other executioners, creating little dynasties of death. Which, if you're wondering, is exactly as awkward as it sounds at a family dinner. Still, these families were professionals. They kept ledgers, wore official robes, and learned their craft like surgeons. They prided themselves on clean, swift work. A single stroke of the sword. That was, at least, the ideal. In practice, executions could be messy, and that's putting it politely. Beheading was seen as the most honorable method, reserved for nobles. But it took skill, too much hesitation, and you'd need a second swing, or a third. Too much enthusiasm, and you might decapitate someone before the ceremony was finished. Executioners practiced with animals, pigs mostly, or on condemned corpses. They had to judge the right angle, the right weight of blade. And when they got it wrong, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was considered a moral failing. There's a story from England in 1587, when Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second half severed it. The third finally did the job. The executioner then held up her head and proclaimed, "God save the Queen," only for it to fall from his hand because her wig came off. And that, really, is the kind of accident that haunts you for life. So when there were no executions, many hangmen practiced, quietly, alone, sharpening their blades, training their apprentices, preparing for the next public spectacle. The hangman's apprentices were usually criminals themselves. That was another perk, or punishment, of the job. If a condemned man survived an execution attempt, sometimes he was offered a deal: become the hangman's helper, or hang again. Many accepted. It wasn't an easy life, but it was, technically speaking, still a life. These assistants learned the trade: how to tie a noose properly, how to handle the block, how to prepare bodies afterward. Some even rose to become full executioners themselves, keeping the grim circle turning. So, on an ordinary day, you might find an executioner and his apprentice out in the fields, chopping wood for the gallows, testing ropes, or simply waiting for the next criminal to arrive. The work was sporadic, but it had to be ready at a moment's notice. And when business was slow, the executioner might be found in his garden, growing herbs. Some brewed beer or distilled spirits, because, of course, they did. And others, perhaps surprisingly, were quite popular with local thieves. After all, who better to bribe for a warning about upcoming executions than the man swinging the axe? So, on the long, quiet days between deaths, the hangman became a kind of shadow citizen, visible but untouchable. Everyone knew who he was, everyone depended on him, and everyone pretended not to see him. There are records from Swiss towns where the executioner's house was deliberately placed at the edge of the city walls, close enough for work, far enough to avoid social contamination. His children might be forbidden from playing with others. His wife might shop at odd hours to avoid gossip. And yet, when the town needed something unpleasant done, a mad dog killed, a dead body moved, a limb amputated, the executioner was summoned. It's a strange paradox, reviled and relied upon, and that's what makes his life oddly fascinating. Not the moments of blood, but the long stretches of silence between them, the time when the executioner, having sharpened his sword and cleaned the scaffold, would simply wait. A note on taste one of the strangest things about reading famine records is how often people describe flavor. They weren't just hungry, they were haunted by the memory of taste. One English peasant wrote in a church record that he dreamed of salt. Another woman, during the Russian famine, said she could smell bread in her sleep. Even in hunger, people remained human. They remembered sweetness, the comfort of warmth, the crackle of frying fat. And perhaps that made starvation worse, because they knew exactly what they were missing. Even in their strictest moments, the church knew it needed nuns. They prayed for the souls of others. They educated girls. They ran hospitals and cared for the poor. And so, their little acts of rebellion were often tolerated, as long as no one made too much noise about them, which, of course, they sometimes did. There's something quietly admirable about that balance. Living within a system you can't escape, yet still finding ways to live as yourself. It's a kind of rebellion that requires patience, wit, and the occasional hidden silk dress. So tonight, as we drift through the quieter corners of history, imagine that man at dusk, sitting outside his small cottage by the walls of a medieval town, hands still smelling faintly of iron and herbs, a mug of ale beside him, listening to the bells in the distance, knowing that one day they'll ring for him to work again. But not tonight. Tonight, even the hangman gets to rest. The forgotten eunuchs who ruled empires tonight were drifting back to the palaces, the ones that glowed in lamplight and smelled faintly of incense, sweat, and ambition, where emperors sat on golden thrones, often confused, occasionally drooling, and behind them stood the real power. Men without heirs, without families, and in many cases, without certain parts. Yes, tonight we're talking about eunuchs. a word that sounds faintly funny until you realize just how deeply it shaped the ancient and medieval world. Because these were the men who guarded emperors, raised princes, whispered in royal ears, and sometimes quietly ran entire empires, all while being officially considered less than men, and yet more trusted than anyone else alive. So, as the lights dim and the modern world fades, let's drift back to the silent corridors of imperial palaces, where the men with no sons ruled over kings who had far too many. The paradox of power, it's one of those historical paradoxes that never quite stops being strange. Eunuchs, men who had been castrated, usually as boys, were, in theory, safe. They couldn't father children. They had no dynastic ambitions. They couldn't found a family line to challenge the throne. And so, quite naturally, they were trusted with everything that mattered. Royal children, royal women, and royal secrets. In almost every ancient empire, China, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, even occasionally in Europe, eunuchs appear quietly in the background. They start as servants, then advisors, then generals. And before long, the emperor himself is signing whatever paper they put in front of him. It's rather impressive, really, considering how many of them began life as slaves. But before we drift into specific stories, we should understand what it meant to be a eunuch. Because this wasn't one profession. It was an entire social category, one both pitied and feared. The making of a eunuch, to be blunt, it wasn't voluntary, at least not usually. Boys were castrated for all sorts of reasons: punishment, enslavement, devotion, ambition. In the Byzantine Empire, castration was considered a mercy compared to execution, which is the sort of moral choice that really sums up the Middle Ages. In China, the system was even more institutionalized. There, the imperial court employed thousands of eunuchs, so many, in fact, that entire bureaucratic ranks were reserved for them. To become one was, perversely, a path to power. Poor families might even offer a son for the position, not because they were cruel, but because, in a strange way, it was opportunity. It's easy to forget that China's emperors lived in near total isolation. Within the Forbidden City, few men were allowed near them, and fewer still were permitted. Inside the women's quarters, the harem, where the imperial wives and concubines lived. Eunuchs could go where no one else could. They were the eyes and ears of the throne. And when you're the only one allowed to whisper in an emperor's ear, you tend to develop opinions, powerful ones. Let's drift to China. There's no empire that perfected the art of the eunuch quite like China. It lasted millennia, from The Han Dynasty in 200 BCE to the Ming Dynasty in the 1600s, eunuchs were everywhere, and they weren't always villains, though many later historians made them out to be. They were simply human, flawed, ambitious, lonely, and sometimes brilliant. One of the most famous of them all was Zheng He, a name you might know, though probably not as a eunuch. He was a Muslim boy from Yunnan, captured by Ming soldiers, castrated, and placed in imperial service. Hardly an auspicious start, but Zheng He rose to become one of the greatest admirals in history. In the early 1400s, he commanded China's treasure fleets, massive ships that dwarfed anything Europe had yet imagined. He sailed across the Indian Ocean to India, Arabia, and even the coast of Africa, leading fleets of hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of men. He was, in every sense, the face of Chinese imperial might, and yet, officially, he was not a man. That didn't stop him from bossing entire kingdoms around. He collected tribute, traded gifts, and planted imperial plaques declaring that the Ming emperor ruled all under heaven. He even brought back giraffes. The Hao Thi emperor was convinced they were mythical, creatures called qilin. It's a strange image, really. A man made physically powerless, commanding the most powerful navy in the world. But that was the paradox of eunuchs. They embodied the tension between vulnerability and control. The politics of the inner court. Not all eunuchs were as lucky as Zheng He. For every admiral, there were thousands of palace functionaries, men who carried messages, cleaned floors, or managed the endless intrigues of the royal harem. In theory, eunuchs were meant to serve loyally, without personal interest. In practice, they were human, and very aware that their fortunes depended on the emperor's mood. Many of them became experts at manipulation. If an emperor was weak, they spoke for him. If he was cruel, they flattered him, and if he died, they immediately switched sides. Dynasties rose and fell, but the eunuchs always remained. Chinese. Philosophers hated this. Confucian scholars wrote entire essays condemning eunuchs as corrupt parasites. Men without virtue and without descendants, as one particularly irritated scholar put it. They accused them of ruining emperors and bankrupting empires. And to be fair, sometimes they did. The Ming Dynasty, for example, was practically run by eunuchs by the 15th century. They controlled the secret police, the treasury, and even the postal system. One of them, Wang Zhen, became so powerful that he convinced the emperor to personally lead a disastrous military campaign, which ended with the emperor captured by Mongols. Wang was executed soon after. Still, the system persisted. because the same qualities that made eunuchs dangerous also made them useful. A eunuch could be loyal. He had no family to betray him, no wife to influence him, no sons to inherit his power. He was the perfect instrument of a paranoid ruler. And many rulers were very paranoid indeed. Let's drift to Byzantium across the world, in the glittering, incense-filled corridors of Constantinople. Another empire discovered the same secret. The Byzantine emperors also found eunuchs very convenient. In fact, they made up a large part of the imperial court. They were chamberlains, generals, bishops, and sometimes even regents. Unlike in China, Byzantine eunuchs weren't always slaves. Some came from noble families who, in a rather disturbing twist, voluntarily castrated younger sons to ensure they could serve in the palace without posing a dynastic threat. Because nothing says family love quite like surgical career planning. And in Byzantium, eunuchs could go astonishingly far. One of the most famous was Joseph Bringas, a eunuch who effectively ruled the empire in the 10th century under Emperor Romanos II. Bringas was the imperial chamberlain, which sounds unassuming, but it meant he controlled access to the emperor. If you wanted to speak to the ruler, you went through him, which meant, of course, he decided who got heard and who didn't. When Romanos died, Bringas tried to keep power by manipulating the court, but the army and a very ambitious general named Nikephoros Phokas had other plans. The general marched into the city, the people rioted, and Bringas fled, disguised as a priest, not his finest day. Still, many eunuchs managed their careers better. Some commanded armies with great success. Others became patriarchs, heads of the church. Because while castration excluded them from marriage, it didn't exclude them from ambition. Byzantine society saw eunuchs as an in-between category. Not fully male, not female, but somehow spiritually potent. In art, they were often shown as androgynous, delicate figures with smooth faces and elaborate robes. They were both mocked and revered, the empire's most elegant contradiction. Power in silence. What made eunuchs so dangerous and so indispensable was their invisibility. They lived close to power, but officially outside the normal hierarchy. They couldn't inherit lands or titles, so whatever influence they had was purely personal, based on whispers, favors, and access. Imagine a system where one word to the emperor could ruin a general's career, or one misplaced rumor could change foreign policy. Eunuchs were the ones who carried those words, and sometimes they were the ones who invented them. Their power wasn't in open authority. It was in quiet suggestion, which made them perfect for a sleepy history story Really, the emotional cost. But behind all this palace intrigue was something more human and sadder. For most eunuchs, life was one of isolation. They were neither men nor women, often mocked or pitied, and forever outside the ordinary rhythm of life. They could not marry, at least not officially. They had no families. They often lived their entire lives inside palace walls, serving one emperor after another, until they grew old and were quietly retired to monasteries or small estates. Some historians describe eunuchs as bitter, scheming creatures, but perhaps it was simply the loneliness talking. Imagine serving a royal child from birth, only to see him grow up, turn cruel, and forget you. Imagine gaining immense power, but never being able to pass it on, to leave any trace behind. Theirs was a power that died with them. So, as the lamps flicker and the empire snores on, we'll pause here, among the marble halls of Byzantium and the crimson pavilions of the Ming Palace, because next we'll drift to the Islamic caliphates, where eunuchs guarded harems, advised caliphs, and sometimes seized the reins of power themselves, quietly, invisibly as always.